Good morning. Welcome to episode 5 of Based on a True Story. This week's book and movie is Killers of the Flower Moon. The book is subtitled The Osage Murders and the Birth of the FBI. Now, before we get to it, I had a great comedy show up in Silverthorne on Saturday night with the High Altitude Comedy guys. The show was at the Block. It was with Joe and Timmy. Just great guys, great comedy scene. You got to want to work with people like that. Nick Ellis came out from Denver headlining. It was a lot of fun. I've got my next comedy show I'm just producing is Thursday, Jan 29th at the new Snowpack Tap Room location in Conifer. Mike Stanley's headlining, Movita feature, and Patrick Scott is opening. So if you didn't know that already, based on what I just said, I'm a comedian, not a historian, but I do love movies. I love nonfiction books. And what I do is I talk about these movies, what they get right, what they made up, but I'm skewing more and more towards what the historical relevance is of the books and the stories and the movies, just because people watch more movies than they read books, and they might take the movies as gospel. So the book, again, is Killers of the Flower Moon, The Osage Murders and the Birth of the FBI by David Graham, who was not one of the screenwriters. Book came out in 2017. The movie came out in 2023, not that long ago. It was directed and the screenplay was co-written by Martin Scorsese. It stars Leonardo DiCaprio as Ernest Burkhart and Robert De Niro, the bad guy William Hale or Bill Hale, and Lily Gladstone as Mollie Burkhart, the wife of Leonardo DiCaprio. The movie's 3.5 hours. Thank you, Martin. It takes 50 minutes just to go over the courtship of Leo and Lily, Ernest Burkhart and Mollie. There's some useful information in that process, but they then also are forced to leave stuff out, right? If you're going to go 3.5 hours. Sturgill Simpson and Jason Isbell, two of my favorite musicians, have roles, and Jesse Plemons is the star of the book, really, the character Tom White, a Texas Ranger recruited by the U.S. government to solve the mystery of the Osage murders. The biggest shortfall of the movie compared to the book is that the book is written like a who-dunnit. It's a page-turner. You don't know who the bad guys are as you're reading. Tom White is the star of the story. It really starts with him coming in and conducting a very challenging investigation for the early 20s. And you learn what he learns as he learns it, but there's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of false leads I'll get into. So you're not sure exactly how this plays out until the end of the story. The movie does the opposite. It starts with De Niro as Hale and Burkhart, who is his nephew. It's pretty clear up front that De Niro has bad intentions and is a bad guy, and you watch him slowly convert his nephew to the dark side. So there are dozens of murders that take place before this story starts, but until you realize they're being murdered, where the book starts, no one really realizes that this is a conspiracy, and it became known to the Osages the reign of terror, this whole period of time. And tragically, even though Tom White does an incredible job, they really only punish 3 of the co-conspirators, if you will, and not nearly to the extent that they should have been. And the author Grant dedicates the last third of the book as almost like an epilogue, saying, okay, after White gets his convictions against Hale and Burkhart and one other guy, Ramsey, he goes back and tries to connect the dots to other murders that weren't even considered murders at the time they happened, and points out what co-conspirators and what crimes were not solved and people did not pay the price. And it's sad, and it's a staggering to really contemplate, as we'll go over. There's not a lot that's relevant to the history that's fact versus fiction in the book versus the movie. So this is going to be mostly about what was going on at the time and place this movie in historical context. And it's a nice follow-up. It could have been a lead-in to last week's episode, The Catcher Was a Spy, but it's really nice lead-in to next week's episode on the assassination of Fred Hampton. So for starters, the movie leaves out the detail of how the Osage ended up in Oklahoma Territory and ended up the richest people per capita on Earth at the time in the 1920s due to oil leases, or what they call head rights. And I'll talk mostly about the progression of Native American rights and citizenship. So Indian citizenship, the act, the Snyder Act under Coolidge, was passed like 101 years ago, right? That granted citizenship to Native Americans in June of 1924. The 14th Amendment should have done that in practice, but Native Americans were effectively, I'll call it, excluded. Though there were some exceptions, like the Dawes Act of 1887 that granted citizenship to Native Americans that accepted some land grants and veterans of World War I. But up until 1948, Arizona and New Mexico had laws that barred many American Indians from voting. And before 1924, Native Americans were often considered part of sovereign tribal nations. But even after 1924, some states denied Native Americans the right to vote until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So again, historical perspective, the book starts in May of 1921, and then it goes back a little bit. So really the story starts 100 years before that, when the Osage were driven from their ancestral lands in Missouri and Arkansas and sent to Kansas to a reservation. As part of the deal, they owned that land, right? Having been forced to cede Missouri and Arkansas. That was a deal that got done with the government, okay? In the 1870s, with more and more immigration pressure, the Osage were essentially forced to sell the land in Kansas, and they used that money to buy land in Oklahoma, which the feds were glad to give them because it looked pretty scrappy and scrubby and not worth much. Now, one of the lawyers representing them in the purchase of the land in Oklahoma was half white, half Native American, and I'm using the language of the book and of the time. And why is that relevant? Well, it might not be, but he definitely looked out for their interests. And specifically, he made sure in the transaction that the Osage had mineral rights. Now, I know it's true out here in the West where I live, and I assume maybe it's true everywhere in most places in the U.S., but often in an undeveloped land deal, in my own personal experience, like I bought undeveloped land a long time ago in Colorado and Idaho, don't own it anymore, but the mineral rights were negotiated and documented separately. So even though you might have owned what was on top of the land, you may not have also owned what was underneath it, or below it, like gold, silver, or in the case of this story, there's oceans of oil. So the oil boom started in 1859 in Titusville, Pennsylvania, right at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. That was taking us off coal and wood and putting us on petroleum diet that, we're still on to this day. Oil was discovered in the late 1800s in Osage County. So they already owned the land. They already had their reservation in Oklahoma. And what would happen is oil companies, big names that you would know to this day, would come in and pay for rights to drill. They were auctioned off, and then they would make quarterly royalty payments on the oil that they drilled there to the Osage. There were 2,200 original members of the Osage tribe that split those royalties. And production then soared around 1907. And then royalties soared. And that's how you get that comment that these were the wealthiest people on earth per capita, because that's 2,200 sounds like a lot. It's not compared to the oil that was taken out of the ground. So this should have been a sovereign nation. That's what's confusing in the story. They were given this land, or they bought this land because they were kicked out of Kansas. They were forced into a transaction. And the people, the Osage, should have been free of the iron thumb of the oppression of the U.S. government. But there was still a U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, and brief history there. That was founded 100 years before this story even started. And we should do a pod on boarding schools, and I'll do some work on that in the Allotment Act of 1887. But the BIA had the power to declare what they considered full-blooded Osage to be incompetent to manage all of the money they were receiving in royalties. And so the Osage were, some of them, including Mollie Burkhart and her sisters and her mother, were assigned guardians who were universally corrupt. And the local businesses would just generally charge the Osage ridiculous prices, ridiculously inflated prices for all of the things, including, tragically, the funerals of all the murdered Osage. There's a reference in the movie to, you're charging me, Osage prices, as a white guy complaining, right? Because there's two pricing systems, one for the whites and one for the Osage. There's a scene, and there's a couple of scenes actually in the movie, where Mollie is sitting before her guardian asking for money from her estate just to pay for something that she wanted to buy, or an improvement in her life. And, the guy could say no, oh, that's frivolous. I don't think we should do that. And so it's horrible, right? Okay. So it's 1921. The Osage are the richest people on earth per capita, even, dealing with the guardians. It's still mathematically their money, even if they can't all access it to the extent they want. But still, generally, if you look at the movie and you read the book, you can see that they have all the trappings of wealth, the Osage. Big homes, cars with drivers, servants in the home, including whites. And the white people can't stand it, right? The white people there, poor whites in Oklahoma Territory, cannot stand that the Osage have so much more wealth than them. And tragically, they can't see the Osage are even equal to humans, and not just whites. So, they somehow shouldn't be eligible to have all this wealth. So it's tragically easy for the evil villain in the story, William Hale, Bill Hale, played by DeNiro, to convince poor whites to kill the Osage and try and consolidate the ownership and get the ownership of the head rights. That's the evil plan, okay? That's the conspiracy at the heart of this story. Normally now, the Osage would leave the head rights to other Osage in the family in their wills. So one sister would leave it to another sister, the sisters would leave it to their mother, who would then leave it to another daughter, and that daughter would leave it to her children, who she could have had, and just looking at the movie and reading the story, most likely had with a white person, okay? Although they really only refer to Osage women being married to white guys. I can't remember a situation where it was the opposite. So if you were the white husband of an Osage woman and who had all the head rights left to her children, the woman dies, the children get the head rights. If the children die, there's no one left to leave it to except for the white father/husband. That's the big conspiracy. And as I said, the book reads like a who-dunnit, right? The movie lets you know pretty quickly that De Niro's character, Hale, is up to no good. And very early on, he's converting Leo DiCaprio's character, Burkhart, to his side. The one thing the book does is insinuate that the Osage have been dying mysteriously for years. Again, no one really picked up that it was a conspiracy. They were dying from, they had a name for it. They called it wasting disease. And as the story, the whodunit, unfolds in the book, you start realizing that they are being poisoned slowly with something like strychnine, or killed, but made it to look like suicide or an accident. But it wasn't enough yet for people to realize that this was being done intentionally and conspiratorially, okay? So the reign of terror, as this period came to be known down the road, once the Osage figured out that they were being killed by somebody to get control of their head rights, that starts, kind of well before the movie plot or the book plot. Although the movie does just have like a little montage of like, I don't know, half dozen funerals to put in your head that this might have been going on before Mollie's sister Anna is killed and another prominent male Osage, Charles Whitehorn, is killed, that people start going, okay, they were murdered. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't suicide. But that takes time. DiCaprio plays Mollie's white husband. Importantly, he's also the nephew of William Hale, as I insinuated earlier. Now, it was Bill Smith, the character played by Jason Isbell, and he does a great job, by the way. He's so good in his little brief appearance. He's married to another of Mollie's sisters, one that died, and then he marries like the next sister, which is a little weird, but he is the one that comes up with the poisoning theory. He was not part of the Hale conspiracy. In fact, he's the one that gets blown up in his own house with his wife, one of Mollie's sisters, and the maid. And that is a 100% true story reflected in the movie. Now, at this time, again, local law enforcement is doing absolutely nothing. Really. Okay. So, by the way, the level of bribery of law enforcement, of judges, and juries at this time was stunning. The book will share a few of those stories that the movie kind of doesn't have time to get into, but it's important. Like, at least in this region, if you had money, you could buy influence. Nothing new under the sun, I guess. Maybe that's one of the messages. So local law enforcement is doing nothing. The Whitehorn estate, after Charles Whitehorn is killed at a similar time as Anna, they actually hired their own investigator, a guy named Burns, a private investigator. And it's tough to figure out from the movie, and I don't remember from the book. I read the book first and then watched the movie. I think he gets beaten up, not killed, but he gets run out of town. Then another agent is hired, also with Osage money generally, this guy named McBride. And in the book, you've learned that he's figured everything out. But he's got the information hidden. He's going to go to D.C. to get help from the feds to punish the perpetrators, and he's killed. In the movie, he's like stabbed in an alley. So the conspiracy is so wide-ranging and advanced that they follow this guy on his way to D.C. and have him killed. And none of those people are held responsible at the end of the day. I'll just jump ahead. And that's part of the tragedy also of this story. So the murders continue. Now, there's a scene where Hale takes out a life insurance policy on a friend of his, an Osage named Henry Rowan. True story. Henry ends up dead, and DeNiro keeps trying to collect on his life insurance. But the governor sends in a state investigator who's crooked himself, and there's an attorney, W.W. Vaughn. He figures everything out also, and he's on his way to D.C. on a train. And in the story, he gets mugged, killed, and thrown from the train, right? So again, insane reach from the conspirators. By the way, as the book points out in the last third, again, none of these crimes were ever solved. Those extended crimes outside of Osage County. So now years go by. Remember, this started in 1921. An organization, federal organization called the Bureau of Investigation at the time, it was then called, it was created in 1908 by Teddy Roosevelt and was being run in the 1920s by a young J. Edgar Hoover, who is a villain, as we will learn more next week about the assassination of Fred Hampton. So it would become the FBI in 1935, just before last week's story, The Catcher Was a Spy, begins, right? So we're jumping around here, the space-time continuum. But anyway, years go by. It's now 1925, and Hoover actually does want to solve these murders. He wants a victory, and he sends in Tom White. He's a Texas Ranger. He's recruited to the Bureau of Investigation and sent to Osage County to solve the murders. And this is basically where the book starts. So we learn about Anna and Rita, Mollie's sisters, and all the other deaths through White's investigation. That's why it's a bit of a page turner, the book. In the movie, Tom White is played by Jesse Plemons, and he doesn't show up in the movie until like 2 hours into the movie, towards the end, because of the way they decided to tell the story and to film it. One of the coolest parts of the book and the story is that White assembles a team, and they all come into town separately with different cover stories, so no one knows who they are or that they're related to White and part of the investigation. Like, there is a part of the story where one of White's fellow agents, comes into town as an insurance salesman, things like that. Now, I'm not entirely sure. It's insinuated, I think, that he sold an insurance policy to DeNiro's character on his land, which he then burns on his crops just to collect the insurance money on a crop that's destroyed. There's nothing this guy wouldn't do. Okay, so this team comes into town. They're undercover individually, but everyone knows who White is. Okay. Again, played by Jesse Plemons, and he's the star of the story, really, in the book. Amazing guy, very stoic and confident and calm, unflappable. Perfect character for Plemons, even if Jesse isn't as physically impressive as it is told that Tom White is, for that time. Big guy. So much going on in the country at this time. And this is what I want to get to. Like Prohibition started in 1920. So the booze that the Osage are drinking comes from an illegal still, which is how I think Hyde is poisoning them slowly. He's their source for getting booze from the still. Sturgill Simpson's character owns the still, and he is one of the bad guys. So I believe Hyde is getting the booze from Sturgill's character, poisoning it, and giving it to the Osage, acting like he's doing them a favor. It's like, hey man, you don't want to get caught with this booze during Prohibition. They'll send you to jail. So let me help you out. Now, Tom White, the Texas Ranger, he's dealing with classic 1920s characters. I mean, some of these names crack you up, like the Al Spencer gang and guys named Curly Johnson, you know? But if you think about it, if you were in your mid 40s, I don't know exactly how old Tom White was at the time he showed up in Oklahoma. But if you're in your mid 40s and you're coming to Oklahoma from Texas, you grew up in the Wild West, the tail end of the 1800s, you know? And that's who these agents, these basically secret agents working for the feds were. So what else is going on? The movie makes 2 to 3 awkward references to the KKK and one reference to the Tulsa Massacre. The Tulsa Massacre in real time took place at the same time that this book starts, also in Oklahoma, as it happens. It's 1921, Black Wall Street. Same story in a way, if you think about it. Whitey can't stand black people having success and wealth, so they take it back through violence. So Oklahoma was segregated at the time by state law. So the movie about the KKK, The Birth of a Nation, came out in 1915, just 6 years before this story starts. So in 1921, that particular year, I looked it up, there were 26 lynchings of black people in the state of Oklahoma. Now, as I said earlier, the whites around Osage couldn't stand the Osage getting this wealthy. So it was easy for Hyde to recruit co-conspirators to slowly murder the Osage and get access to their wealth via their head rights. By the way, in Tulsa, 1921, called the Black Wall Street, it was one of the wealthiest black communities in the U.S. at the time, and attackers burned 35 square blocks of what was called Black Wall Street to the ground. 10,000 black residents were left homeless, and most left the area for good. And that is, if I can find a movie and a book, a story worth telling in and of itself. But I'm just setting the tone for what's going on at the time of this movie and this story relative to Oklahoma specifically and the nation at large. So I'm not sure the purpose of Scorsese bringing this up in the movie other than to do what I do, which is set important historical context. Like if they were telling this as a who-dunnit, it might have been a tease, like, oh, maybe it was the KKK, you know, but they didn't tell it that way. So it's a little bit awkward the way it was included in the movie. As I say, there are 2 or 3 references in the film to the KKK. Now, again, there was no mystery in the movie, unlike the book, so it wasn't just offering up a tease with alternative backstories to the murders. Okay, so almost an epilogue, because there's really not much else to talk about in terms of the movie's fact versus fiction. Only 3 people went to jail for these crimes, and they were not executed, despite these being murder convictions, essentially. They all got out early, despite life sentences, and they all died free men. White, the hero, Jesse Plemons' character, very cool part of the book, he actually accepted a job to run the famous prison in Kansas, Leavenworth, massive prison. And it's interesting, he had been the head of a prison in Texas and was doing a great job before he was recruited by J. Edgar Hoover and the Bureau of Investigation to come solve the murders of the Osage. And where I'm getting to is the cool part of the story is the first 2 new inmates upon his assuming control of Leavenworth were William/Bill Hale, De Niro's character, and a guy named Ramsey, a.k.a. Byron Smith. And he was the guy that Hale convinced to kill Henry Rowan for the life insurance money. So that's kind of funny, right? The worst people to get away with that we know were guilty, the 2 doctors in the movie that were prescribing penicillin falsely for Mollie and slowly poisoning her through that prescription. They were also involved in the shady autopsy of Rita, Mollie's sister. But again, when you think about the murders of the 2 private investigators who were on their way to DC to blow the cover off this thing, when you think about the half dozen at least murders that took place before Whitehorn and Rita's murders. I mean, there are just so many people involved that never paid the price for this. So wrapping it up, the movie's 3.5 hours. It's all true. I think in 3.5 hours, the movie could have done more to set the historical context, and White's investigation job was way tougher and more amazing than the movie makes out. Like, there were double agents, triple agents, false statements, witnesses reneging, lies, threats to life. I mean, it was something. And Tom White is just an incredible American historical character. So, and now the FBI exists. You know, skipping over last week's Catcher Was a Spy, but sticking with the FBI, we go to the books, 2 of them for the next episode: The Assassination of Fred Hampton, How the FBI and the Chicago Police Murdered a Black Panther, and a book called COINTELPRO, the FBI's Secret War on Political Freedom. And the movie associated with those books indirectly is Judas and the Black Messiah. And that's next week's episode. Once again, I've got a comedy show in Conifer on January 29th. Mike Stanley's headlining. Mo Vita's featuring. Patrick Scott is opening. It's the new location on Main Street. Come check it out. Otherwise, I will talk to you next week.